Welcome to Nanog's Internet Innovators, a series that allows you to learn more about some of the brightest and boldest tech minds of our time. Join us as we look to the past, present, and future of the internet and talk to the innovators who are actually there. Every month, we will be interviewing internet innovators who revolutionize the internet as we know it. Watch as we host conversations with those that are building the internet of tomorrow. Good afternoon, Steve Crocker. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine.
We are so excited to talk to you. Another amazing father of the internet is sitting with me today. Where are you joining us today, Steve?
I'm in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., and it's a great pleasure to be with you.
So I'm in Colorado. We're joining via the internet, which is very apropos for who I am talking to today. Steve, you are known as the man who invented the instructions for the internet. You were there when the internet was born, Internet Hall of Fame inductee, UCLA classmate of Vint Cerf. Crocker has been involved in the internet since its inception in the late 1960s and early 1970s while he was a graduate student at UCLA. You were part of the team that developed the protocols for the ARPANET and laid the foundation for today's internet as we know it. Why are you known as the man that invented the instructions for the internet?
Well, that's taken from a New York Times op-ed piece that I wrote on the 40th anniversary of the creation of the Request for Comment series. So I don't use that terminology about inventing the instructions, but that was the headline that they put on the article. What actually happened was during the early design phase, when we were scratching our head about how were we going to evolve this network, how were we going to create this network, what were the protocols, and what was the architecture for the protocols. It was a very informal process. As it happened, rather than it being carefully organized and scripted from the top down, it was more of a field of dreams approach in which the initial 4 sites had been designated, and UCLA happened to be the first of those 4. And then representatives from each of those 4 sites, it was left to them to figure out, well, how are we going to use this network? And you know how things are done in a university. You delegate downward, and graduate students are the so-called second lowest form of life. And so graduate students at these institutions or equivalent staff members were the ones who were left for this minor job of just figuring out what the protocols should be to connect up the different machines. The hardware aspects and the hardware associated with the internet, with the ARPANET communications, the so-called IMPs, those were all formally contracted, and there was a careful plan. All of that very, very well done. And then this minor detail of what were the host computers going to say to each other was, as I say, left as a kind of small exercise for graduate students. So several of us from these different sites got together, and we started to talk and decided to keep talking and laid out a rough plan of the way we wanted to see things. And the most important aspect of it was that we knew that we didn't know all the answers, and that we were not going to design a complete system. We were going to design more like a toolkit and have it be extensible, and it would grow from there. And as part of that process, we talked informally. We had meetings every several weeks. And this was, of course, before there was a network. So the only way we had to communicate were either telephone or face-to-face, or by sending things on paper through the U.S. mail, which later became known as snail mail. But even then, we didn't have that term. So this informal group would gather together, and we moved it around from one site to another so that we could share the burden of hosting, but also learn what was going on at each other's places. And after several months of these meetings, they started in August of 1968, and then I'll take you fast forward to March of 69. We were sitting around in a meeting in Utah and reviewing the ideas that we had been discussing. And we said, it's time we start writing this stuff down. I mean, we are, after all, academics, and we're in research programs here, so we ought to write this stuff down. And we dealt out assignments to ourselves around the table. You've been talking about this, so why don't you write that down, and so forth. And I took on one of those assignments, and then I took on what I thought was a trivial clerical task of organizing those notes, and went home. And I found that small clerical task was weighing very heavily on my mind, because I was fearful that the mere act of writing down what we were thinking about might trigger a backlash. We were, nobody had chartered us. We had no authority. We had no specific role. And I was afraid that it might seem like we were being presumptuous, like we were insisting that we were in charge. And maybe I made much more of it than I should have, but it caused a number of sleepless nights. And one night, late at night, I couldn't sleep, and I started to write down what the rules were for these notes. And the main thing was just write down whatever you want. There is no requirement. Make them as informal as you want. Questions without answers, partial designs, whatever. And the idea was to stimulate a conversation. One of the other people, Bill Duvall, had suggested using the term request for comments. And so I grabbed onto that, and I said, we'll make every one of these notes, no matter how formal or informal it actually is, we'll just call it a request for comments. I figured it was a temporary hack. I figured it would last 6 months, maybe a year. Someday there would be formal documentation. There would be people who would do this right. That was more than 50 years ago. Now those notes have evolved, and they've become more formal. But I was genuinely surprised that they survived as long as they have, even though they've transformed quite a bit. So on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the first RFC, New York Times treated us very favorably, and we wrote a little history piece in the op-ed page, and they designated that as in terms of giving the network its instructions.
Such a fascinating tale, all those sleepless nights, and being in that situation of just being such a pioneer in this area, and then all the feelings that go along with that when you are charting new territory. Can you talk more about that?
So a couple of interesting things. We knew, and when I say we knew, it's as if I'm speaking on behalf of everybody, and really, I'm really only speaking on behalf of what I knew, but what I think was somewhat shared, that this network was going to be useful to people. It was going to actually be a transforming experience, and that at some point, you wouldn't want to have a computer that wasn't connected to the network. Sorry for the double negative. Every computer you would want to be connected. Before that time, computers, there was no easy way to get information from one computer to another. The most common was either a deck of punch cards, you may have seen those in a museum, or a reel of magnetic tape. Those are not very fast, and it's kind of bulky to try to do that sort of thing. But once you had computers that were connected to each other and you could send messages back and forth, the world really, really opens up. And we had visions of relatively complex computations that might live on multiple machines simultaneously and interact in real time with each other, not just interact with a person, but it might be a complicated computation that needed different machines for different purposes. But that was the vision that was evident to us going in. We knew the simple things to do would be two. One of them was to remotely log in, just as if you had dialed up a remote machine. And the other was to move a file from one place to another. But we also knew that we could certainly do those things, but if we designed only to do that, we would be giving away an awful lot of room there. There's a lot more that one could do. And we wanted to make sure that the possibilities for more interesting interactions, more interesting connections, ways of ganging multiple machines together on a single task. All of that we wanted to make room for, and we knew we couldn't design all of that. So we chose an approach of saying, well, we'll bite off small pieces of this and make it open so that people can build on top of that. And then part of your question is, so how far into the future were we able to see from that point? How much of today's system did we envision? And the answer is a good portion, certainly not everything. But we had the advantage because of the environment we were in, and the environment were the advanced computer science research places, that is, besides the network, each of the places that was connected to the network was in itself doing future research, if you will. Most notably, at SRI, Doug Engelbart was doing interactive graphical-based text systems with hypertext, and he had invented the mouse. And so in 1968, you could sit there in his laboratory doing the same things that everybody now does with small devices that you can buy from your local computer store and that every child knows how to use. But it was a big deal 50, 60 years ago. And not reproducible, not commercially available. But you could see the future with it. There was no question that that was eventually going to happen, just a question of when and how. I don't know that we envision social networks in quite the way that they've developed. We did see very quickly spam and certain other bad behaviors. It was possible to find on a given computer. There were some of the computers had a way of asking, where is the following user? And you'd be told sitting in front of console such and such on room number such and such. And that's very helpful for a small group that is compatible with each other. When you start connecting these computers together and you can find out that that person is sitting across the country and in a particular room at a particular hour, it opens up some negative possibilities that you might not want. So we could sort of see some of these things in the future, but they were very, very modest compared to the prospect of being able to do useful work. So I've cut you off sort of, and I'm sure you want to steer this in some direction, but that's kind of a long answer to what we were doing at the time and what we had envisioned. Sometimes I joke about it in this way, and we're now 50 plus years past the point at which we were building it, and somebody will come up to me and say, so how much did you how much could you see about what was coming on? How are things going compared to what you had in mind? And I usually answer, everything is proceeding exactly on schedule.
What was your life personally like during that time? I
had been an undergraduate at UCLA. I had gone off to MIT to study artificial intelligence. I had been there for about a year and a half, and I came back to UCLA in the summer of 1968. And my plan had been to spend just the summer to make a bit of money and work with my friend Vint Cerf. I'll tell you more about him in a minute, and the professor, Jerry Estrand, who I'd worked for as an undergraduate. During that summer, from a personal point of view, all of the following happened. One is, at the end of the summer, I realized that I was not keen to go back to MIT, just as a personal matter. I had not really been thriving. I had learned a lot. I had helped write a paper on the first real chess program that was working. Very, very bright people. But I found the place cold. And I'm not talking about the weather, which was also cold. But it was not an environment in which I was naturally engaging very forcefully. MIT is a great institution, and it's probably just the luck of how I happened to be there and the particular set of people that I was interacting with, or maybe it was me personally. But in any case, and meanwhile, the summer at UCLA was really very good. We had a very good group and was thriving. And then there was this network project, which had not been on my radar. But over the course of the summer, it went from something that was mentioned at the beginning of the summer to a full-fledged, we're going to make this go, because UCLA was scheduled to be the first node on the network. And I found that involving. I enjoyed the interactions. It wasn't what I set out to do, but I had quite a lot of experience programming as an undergraduate and systems work. And so I was in a good position to think about the technical issues underneath this and help push forward. And not alone, there were others, but we were all able to talk to each other and collaborate. And so that was a very positive experience. So at the end of the summer, I talked to Estrin, who I had worked for as an undergraduate, and he said, well, if you want to come back to UCLA, no problem. We'll put you in the PhD program, skip the master's. You don't have to take any classes. He made a good deal out of it. And I made a good show. I thought about it for a week, and more sleepless nights, as it were. And made the decision to come back to UCLA and continued my graduate work there. And so that's mostly what was going on in my life at the time.
Were you single? Did you have kids? Do you have kids?
I do have kids, but I did not then. I don't want to get into too many of the details, but yes, there was social interactions and of all sorts. Los Angeles in the late 60s was a pretty interesting place in terms of social revolution and so forth. That is not so much that I want to document on the record here, but it was definitely a coming of age experience, if you will.
UCLA ended up being the birthplace of the internet. Why do you think Southern California is kind of the mecca of this innovation?
So that's an interesting question. I'll provide a handful of details and then address the larger question that you're asking. Vint and I had met each other in high school and had become quite good friends throughout high school. And then for undergraduate work, he went off to Stanford. I went to UCLA. We stayed in reasonably close contact. And then after he finished at Stanford, and because I spent much more time on computers than in classwork, it took me much longer to get through undergraduate program. He came back to Los Angeles and worked for a little while, and then he was looking for graduate school. And as I say, I was working for Jerry Estrin on campus, and I introduced Vint to Estrin, and that worked out well. And Vint became a graduate student at UCLA. Vint got married in. So we both graduated high school in 61, and Vint got married in September 66. So not long after he was out of Stanford in June of 65, I guess. So relatively soon, he got married, and I was his best man. Several years later, when I got married, he was my best man. So we were, and we've had a very close relationship over a long period of time. It's been very nice, positive relationship. John Postel had gone to the same high school, but we didn't know him then. I don't know what he was doing. I don't know what the circles were, but Vint and I were in, sort of more or less the same circles. But John showed up in graduate school, and so we were all part of the same relatively small group, and got to work on the network together along with a few other people. Now, you're asking about some of the social things. At MIT, toward the end of my time there, I realized, this is very personal and small almost uninteresting detail. But here I am, a youngster, 22 years old, I think, and I noticed my sideburns are out of control, that I'm shaving too high, that I haven't quite mastered getting this right. So I decided I would let my hair grow in order to recalibrate the sideburns. And in those days, my beard grew fairly rapidly. And so in short order, without much of a plan, I had a significant beard. And there was nothing philosophical or political about it at all, but there it was. And I noticed walking down the street that policemen looked at me a little more harshly, and women looked at me a little longer. And I thought, gee, there's a trade-off. And so I let it grow. And so by the time I came back to UCLA, I had a significant beard, and I just sort of let it grow and grow that way, and for many years. John Postel had an even bigger beard and long hair, and he was always very informally dressed, blue jeans maybe, and if he was wearing shoes, there might be flip-flops or something. Vint Cerf, on the other hand, tended to dress fairly formally. And
that doesn't surprise me for some reason. I interviewed Vint, and he was quite dapper.
Right. Not uncommon for him to have a suit on. But, none of us cared about any of that one way or the other.
So this cultural revolution is happening, and also this digital revolution, this technological revolution is taking place at the same time. And you, Vint Cerf, John Postel are all like early 20s. What did you guys all do for fun? Like, what were you doing on a Saturday night?
Well, there were a lot of Saturday nights where we were on the computer. I spent from 1968 to 1971 at UCLA, and then I got distracted again. I was offered a job at ARPA, now called DARPA, in Washington. So that meant working for the government, working for the Defense Department, in fact. A fairly responsible job of overseeing research and, in essence, writing the checks to support the research. So I had a top secret clearance and a beard, and the Vietnam War was in high gear. And so there were these two worlds underway, if you will. One was supporting high quality research, and the other was all the demonstrations that were taking place outside. And in fact, so that, I said 1971, and Nixon was president, and then there was Watergate in 1972, and by 1974, he's forced out of office. And so Washington was a very, very interesting place. I actually went down and sat in the Watergate hearings one day. And when I'm out on the street, I look like a hippie who's anti-government, but I go to work wearing a suit, and as I said, had security clearances. And it was very interesting to watch the interplay of these different cultures. As I said, I had no particular commitment to the beard as a statement of any sort. It just was there. And when I was preparing to move to Washington in 71, I didn't know how the beard was going to go over. I thought, well, if it's in the way, I'll get rid of it, but we'll try it out. So I show up in Washington, and it was very interesting to read the room when you walk in. It did not have the negative effect that I was expecting. It actually had the opposite, like, oh, this guy must actually know what he's talking about. He's not here because of his looks. He must. So it was instant credibility, in fact, which was bizarre. I had a very high respect for the people that I worked with, both military people and civilian people.
It's interesting that a beard could mean so much during that time. I think that, like, facial hair is so not an issue nowadays, right? In terms of professional, non-professional. And so it's interesting that this is like such a highlight of what you remember during those times of how people perceived you, and especially when you were in such a place of esteem.
It was an issue in some places, not very many, but you'd hear stories that some senior officers, generals, wouldn't let you in if you had a beard. It was taken as a signal in some places, but mostly not. Mostly people were a lot more sensible.
Do you have any stories about the old days with Vint that you'd like to share?
Until you added that. In high school, we were math geeks, and we hung out and found ways to make life interesting without breaking the law. Mostly, we spent a whole weekend designing a three-dimensional chess game, mostly by getting 8 chessboards and building a structure to fit them in. And then we did all that, and then figured out the rules for 3D chess didn't work out very well. We spent another weekend trying to replicate some experiments in photography that had some spectacular results, but we couldn't replicate them. Some other things. I had gotten into computers in high school, which meant that I had to go over to the university to get access to them. One day I dragged Vint with me on a Saturday to use a computer that I was allowed to use in the engineering department at UCLA, but I was just a kid. I was in high school. I didn't have any keys or anything. And this was before the buildings were all locked up, before the student demonstrations and security issues and so forth. But we arrived at UCLA on this Saturday and found that the building was locked. Once, if we got inside, all the rooms were wide open and there wasn't anybody around, but the building was locked. We'd driven some distance, and I was quite crestfallen. Then observed that the second floor window was open. And I thought, no, we're not really. And the next thing I know, he's on my shoulders, climbing through this window. And then he comes around and he opens up the institutional door, with a big push bar. And then we taped the door so that we could get in and out during the day and go to the cafeteria and get some lunch and so forth. And when we were done, we cleaned up properly, and there was no issue whatsoever. So that was spring of '61. 11 years later, I'm now working in Washington, as I mentioned, and responsible position and a security clearance. And the Watergate burglars get caught. And why did they get caught? They got caught because they taped the door to the Watergate, and a plainclothes guard saw the tape, and the lookout across the street didn't recognize that it was a guard because he was in plain clothes, and the rest is history. And that led, relatively, not so quickly at the time, but relatively quickly led to the first resignation by a president. So it was a very big deal. When I read about the taped door, the shiver that went down my spine was something. There are plenty of things, now we've known each other all our lives, and we've followed each other through various adventures. He got involved with ICANN and then invited me to be the founding chair of the Security Stability Advisory Committee, and I spent 15 years inside of ICANN, eventually as chairman of the board, which he had been several years earlier. So it was sort of back and forth.
Did Vint have the suit on in high school?
Yes, I thought that he had a I thought that he had a three-piece suit, but he set me straight that the three-piece suits didn't come until he came to Washington himself and bought some suits because he was going to testify before Congress. But he would occasionally get dressed up in a suit for high school. I did that a couple of times myself. It turns out that if you've got a test coming up and you want to feel really good and powerful and in charge, getting dressed up can help. Just in terms of the way one feels. But he made he was much more regular about that. I don't think he wore a suit every day, but he definitely, and then it became a trademark, and he became quite famous for it, and he's quite comfortable in it, so that's fine.
How did that camaraderie, with these people at a young age, do you think shape your career?
Well, it's nice to have people to talk to, and to bounce ideas off of, and to show what you're working on. In many ways, I was driven by internal thoughts, a picture of what I wanted to do or problems I wanted to solve. But then you start interacting with other people, and you can see a bigger world. One of the people that I met as part of the networking activity broadly introduced me to he and his wife set up a blind date with a woman who I wound up marrying, and so that certainly changed my life a lot. And you asked earlier about kids. So we have 2 kids, and each of them now has 2 kids. So it's a perfect balanced tree, as it were. And both very, very smart and capable and professionally successful. 1 doctor, 1 lawyer, perfect Jewish family, as it were.
You've done well. When you think about who you were then as an innovator versus who you are now as an innovator, how do the 2 compare and contrast?
There's an element that is the same, which is the way I'm tuned is I look at a problem and I try to tear it apart and understand the basics. I'm analytic in that sense. And try to dig down into first principles. I don't think I had a very good sense then as to how hard it is to get things done and what it takes, and so the exuberance of youth and the difficulty of going from concept to completion. I'm a little bit better, but definitely a long way from perfect about that now. So it's more the same than different, unfortunately. I wish it were even better, but I have a little more tolerance for 2 things. One is for just the frailties that we all have, and I also have a somewhat more appreciation for the differences in the approaches that people take to lives. Not everybody has to think and have the same set of values, that you don't have to have a black and white picture about there's only one way to do things.
What would you say your greatest lessons have been on failure and success?
Shake it off, keep going. Try to learn from mistakes and in a constructive fashion, and don't overreact. Don't underreact, but also don't overreact. I remember a conversation I had, again, with Jerry Estrin. I forget the context of it, but it was about a company that had failed. And I thought, boy, his life is over. I mean, he's failed. And Estrin's reaction was, no, he's just learned, and things will go on from there. And I took note of that, and that perspective wasn't life-ending. And now, of course, we've watched boom and bust cycles. We've watched companies get started instantaneously. I've done a couple of those myself, and the results are all over the map. Sometimes there are big successes; those are the ones you hear about. But the statistics are that a lot of them are modest, and many of them just die. You put the money in, or you start them up, and then they go a certain distance, and then they come to a natural end, and that's all just part of the game, in a positive sense. I mean, it's just a natural cycle.
Have you always had an entrepreneurial spirit, or how did that begin?
I don't actually think of myself quite that way, or at least the way that those words usually are used. Typically, when somebody is described that way, it means that their focus is how do you start a venture for the purpose of creating high value, financial success, and then serially going on and doing that over and over again. I have generally tended to be more focused on solving interesting problems, and if the solution to a problem involves putting together an organization and a set of people and getting some funding and so forth, that's fine. but there are other times when what you need to solve a problem is best done in an academic or a nonprofit environment or in some other setting. I think, with some respect for the entrepreneurial cycle of things, my approach of treating management and entrepreneurial activities as sort of one of the tools that one might use is not as strongly tuned to being successful as an entrepreneur per se, as people who have that attitude in life that say, I'm going to be good at creating value, starting things up, selling companies, taking them public or something. So I've had the positive experience of being associated with a couple of financial successes, which has been certainly made a big difference in my life and my family's life. But I'm much more focused on solving problems that pay off in a broader sense for the community, create new capabilities, or serve the needs of the community and the world.
What are some of those needs being served that you're working on?
Well, a lot of my time has been spent on network security issues. The internet has suffered. It's benefited from huge growth, and it's suffered from that growth being accompanied by software that has lots of holes that get exploited by people taking advantage of other people, and a whole litany of things from ransomware to harassment and so forth. And I've always thought that we could make big improvements in that area. In the last 2 decades, I guess, I've been heavily involved with ICANN, which has a mission of trying to be helpful to the internet, and at the same time, it's loaded with a hell of a lot of bureaucracy. And the question is, how do you balance all of that? All that bureaucracy is necessary because you have to bring a very diverse set of people and points of view together. There's an old saying that war is too important to be left to the generals, and the corresponding thing is that computing and networking is too important to be left to the technologists, and so you get politicians and everybody involved. And it becomes a very, very complicated environment in which to try to make sensible decisions. So I've enjoyed working in that environment. It's been challenging. I don't know how successful, but I've done what I could there. And I've entered that, as I mentioned, from a security orientation. But even if you come from a security orientation, there's a lot of controversy as to, so what does security really mean? And it's a whole other discussion that we can have. But there's a range of different problems, and you can't get people to agree even on what the right problem is.
What do you most want people to know about here in 2021 in your work with ICANN, and that we are going through such huge shifts every day? What do you want to say about it?
Here's what I want to say. It is possible to improve the systems that we have. One of the things that I hear repeatedly are that there's no way to make secure systems, that it's always going to be a game of, somebody will find a way to break in and there's no way to fix that. I think that's fundamentally unnecessary. I don't mean to make light of it, but these are systems that have been put together by us, by humans, by people. And there are other areas in our lives where we do not tolerate the level of dysfunction that we suffer for the network. You get into an elevator and you don't think twice about whether it's safe because they don't tend to fall 10 stories all at once and kill the people in them. But if they did, we would treat elevators very differently. Cars are a mixed bag. Airplanes, we depend upon, pretty strongly. It's a rare event when a plane goes down and people die. Why can't we achieve similar quality and security, if you will, in the systems that we deal with, in terms of protecting ourselves, in terms of not being subject to fraud and to other dramatic failures that impinge on us? So to your question, what do I want people to think about? Not just dream, but to really believe that it is possible to do better and to demand that happen, and that's neither impossible, nor does it have to come at the cost of shutting everything down or limiting what we can do with computers.
What would you say to your younger self with all the knowledge that you have now?
I'm not sure I know what I would say, because the direction I set out on and what actually happened were different, and I've benefited quite a bit, and I don't know that I could give somebody advice that would match my good fortune in a way. Pick problems that are worthy and nonetheless are within your ability, and then work like hell to make it happen, is the general advice that I would give. But I've watched a lot of people make choices, and sometimes people choose very carefully things that they know they're going to be successful about, and in some sense choose less interesting problems, but those need to be done, so it's fine if there's a bunch of people that do that. I've watched people who have big dreams and no way of getting anywhere close to them, but they're stimulating, so it's a little hard to know. But I would say, just from a personal management point of view, of choosing a path, it's important to survive the experience. So don't go off the deep end. Keep things in perspective, and nonetheless dream as big as you can.
That's an interesting way that you put that. Survive the experience. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
I've watched and been in a lot of situations where the pressure builds up. You're in a company that is a startup, and you're trying very hard to make it go, and so people start working around the clock and being very hard on each other. I've watched political situations that get very tense, and the attitude I've had, and particularly if I had people working for me or I've been working in a group, is that there's no venture like that, no business or even academic pursuit, which is more important than good mental health and good physical health. And to put it in the extreme, if it kills you, it wasn't a good experience. Ideally, you don't have to worry about it too much, but if there are danger signs, pay attention to them, because, as I said, there's just no business, no academic pursuit, no political pursuit, which is more important than living a healthy life and being a healthy individual, and nurturing the people around you as well. I mean, I've watched people get so wound up in their jobs that their marriages fail, or they're horrible people to be around. I started a research laboratory at Aerospace Corporation. They invited me to set up a research lab in computer science that they didn't have. And they prided themselves very properly on the high quality of scientific research that took place in the other laboratories. And the challenge, essentially, for me was, could I put together a first-class research laboratory in computer science? And it's tough because there was competition, as there is continuously, for the best talent. And how do you be realistic about that? And one of the things that I thought hard about was, I said, I've watched some very high-powered environments. I mentioned MIT, but not alone. Others, where very, very smart people, the best in the world, get together, and they are sometimes very hard on each other. They behave like jerks, fundamentally. And the question that occurred to me, and so I was around 40 at the time that I remember thinking through this. Is it a necessary adjunct of trying to have excellence that you have to tolerate that sort of behavior? And I didn't have to think about it more than a couple of seconds. I said, no, I don't see why those two things have to be intertwined. One can set a culture and a standard of behavior in which you have a positive working environment and you treat each other well. And that does not mean that you have to lower your standards about the quality of the work.
What are you currently working on?
One of the problems that I encountered during my time at ICANN was the registration process for the domain name system has grown up in a very peculiar way. When you register for a domain name, you get asked for contact information of the registrant and maybe an admin contact and a tech contact and so forth. And then there is a system, or had been a system, in which you could look up the information related to a domain name registration. And that whole system evolved over 40 or 50 years in an undisciplined way and became very, very messy. The information was inaccurate. It got abused a lot. And there were a lot of hassles about privacy and accuracy and other aspects. And I watched the ICANN. This is a core area for ICANN to be working in, and I watched the political processes try to tackle this and keep running into terrible problems of people just not seeing eye to eye, not engaging in constructive conversation. And in some cases, certain parties found it helpful to their own cause to make sure that nothing changed or that there was no progress. So when I stepped away from ICANN 4 years ago, this sat in my craw. And I've been working quietly with a very good group of people, sort of behind the scenes, trying to rethink what the issues are and put together an approach to helping others solve the problem of what information should be collected, how it should be managed, and how it should be made available and to whom and under what circumstances. And it's got the full set of social issues related to privacy, related to surveillance on the one side, related to accuracy, related to costs. And what's been challenging, it seems like it ought to be a simple problem, but it's been challenging to try to put those pieces together. So that's what I've been working on.
So what are your predictions for the next 5, 10, 20 years for the internet?
It's going to be a complicated period. There's going to be strong negatives and strong positives. On the strong positives, you have ever-increasing bandwidth, which means that the kind of thing that we're doing this very minute of having a video conversation and live voice, which we couldn't do, we could only dream about when we started building the network originally.
Absolutely.
And now we can do that around the world. Not everywhere, not with everybody. Only half the people in the world are connected, which is pretty awesome. But the other half is going to be hard. That is all going to progress. But there also are going to be political issues in which governments are going to try to regulate, legislate, control various aspects. And I'm not talking only about the Russia and China, for example, which come quickly to mind, but even the U.S. and Europe and every part of the world has some problem that it thinks it can solve by with a heavy hand, we'll say. We're going to have to sort our way through that, and there are no easy solutions. but that is going to be a big aspect of how the internet seems to us.
What are your personal thoughts on that?
I think that there is a lot of value in taking responsibility for what you do. That translates into identification. I'm not trying to say you need a license to use the network or that everything you do has to be observed. But I think total anonymity has not been a positive value. There are specific and limited circumstances under which anonymity is important, but there are ways of doing that without making that the norm. If you had traceability as to who is doing what, that would make life a lot better. You then also, of course, need an awful lot of protection against that knowledge about what people are doing being misused. And so that gets into sort of core values of not only government, but also big companies misusing the data. So that's a piece of the answer for you. But getting back to your question about where things are going, one of the things that's going to be pretty interesting, we already have the ability to translate speech into text to a certain degree. What is going to come is translating speech into speech in another language so that you and I could be talking in different languages and nonetheless conversing. We're not there yet, but it'll happen. And when that happens, it will further challenge the barriers to globalization, the barriers to interaction across borders, and further challenge the world order to some extent. All of that is going to be swallowed up or combined with climate change and other aspects that are going to affect us. And so it's a little hard to know which of these big effects are going to dominate.
So you mean, so we'll be able to talk, we'll be able to travel and communicate to anyone via our like cell phones, essentially. It's like that.
Yep.
And the abilities, like if that's that's going to bring to the table, like the possibilities is, I mean, what are you foreseeing with that?
Well, I don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, a simplistic thought that some of us had in the early days of networking was it was going to bring people together. In the extreme, it would be the end of war. And I remember saying that once in Vint. I was in the same room with Vint, and he said, "Yeah, that's what they thought about the telegraph. 100 years, more or less, earlier." I don't think it's going to be a panacea, but it will be a game changer. Now the question is, how is it going to change? That I can't tell you exactly, but it will, at least to some extent, tear down the sense of isolation and we don't have to pay attention to the rest of the world. We can just take care of things ourselves. I think is going to ebb away, not quickly, not uniformly, not everywhere, but we're going to find ourselves living in a world in which we have to know about all the other places on the planet, not just our town or our city or our state or our country.
When I'm thinking about this, I imagine, because communication, like there's so much, I mean, just in you and I talking that could like be misinterpreted. And I'm wondering, in like with the stakes being higher in a situation where you're talking to somebody from a foreign country with a completely different set of cultural norms and and speaking to them and like using sarcasm or just small things that we use in our language that other cultures may not. How is the technology going to keep up with that?
I like the question. There are indeed differences, but there's also similarities. I suspect that there's humor, there's sarcasm, there's nuances in every culture that are not the same, but that are equally rich, and that one might have to learn and get exposed to that. But I don't think that's all that hard to do. I mean,
is the technology going to keep up with that? Like, is the technology going to be able to be like, oh, hey, P.S. This is in this culture, this is very normal. This is they're being sarcastic. This is a humorous thing that they're saying. Is that going to be part of that? Do you think? Do you see that, or is it just going to be like straight up like Google Translate, where it's just?
So you think it's hard for an AI process to detect sarcasm?
I don't know. I'm asking you. I guess where my question is coming from is that I lived in Italy for a bit, and I actually lived with a 80-year-old man that didn't speak any English, and we were communicating through Google Translate, and this was in 2017, and a lot of the times, like I think there was a time where I asked him if he could drop me off somewhere, and he was like, "Why would you want me to like?" He thought that I wanted to pick me up and drop me on the floor. Right. And then there was like certain things where that just like there was different just in how he spoke and how I spoke, and there was the sarcasm and like second language, and there was just these little things that Google couldn't quite keep up with as we were trying to communicate to one another. And so I'm curious if that part is going to evolve as well, where we're not just being able to translate, but also like these catch on to
get the nuances, to get the humor, to get the irony and all that. I would say yes, in a heartbeat, actually. I think I can understand that it might, given the experience that you have with today's technology or yesterday's technology in that setting, it might seem a stretch. But think how far things have come. There's a story that goes back to the very beginnings of machine translation, in which there was a Russian English translation system, and somebody put in the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And it came out that the wine is good, but the meat is spoiled. So there are, sort of classic difficulties in translation. But today you wouldn't have that problem at all. I mean, the translations are far better than that. And we're still at the earliest stage. I think just focusing on the specific, which is a very interesting question that you've asked about the cultural differences. I suspect that it's not as hard as you are imagining. That as you look at how these translations are done these days, it's not that there is a very precise set of rules and it grinds forever on the words that you put in and then pushes out the precise translation. It's got a huge database, absolutely enormous database of pairs of utterances and ideas that are all put together. And you can take that idea and extend that to cover the issues that you're talking about humor and culture and so forth. You might even get inner city kids and suburbans to actually understand each other with the same technology.
Yeah, that's a whole other question with different degrees of language within, I guess, class system. But yeah, super interesting. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I feel like I've talked too much already.
That's why we called you down here. Yeah, you're doing your job.
I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a hell of a ride, and I still enjoy it, so I still keep doing it, and it's afforded an opportunity to be helpful, I think, and also quite enjoyable to meet a lot of people and to get to know the world a little bit.
Thank you so much, Steve, for being here and talking with me and telling me all these wonderful stories. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.